In the suffocating darkness before dawn on March 16th, 1616, a sound tore through the marble corridors of Topkapi Palace that would haunt the most powerful man on earth for the rest of his short life. It was not the clash of swords. It was not the thunder of cannons. It was the scream of a 10-year-old girl, a child, his daughter, Sultan Ahmed I, 26 years old and master of 3 continents, stood frozen in his war room as that sound reached him through layers of stone and silence. His hands, the same hands that had signed execution orders for thousands, trembled against the campaign maps spread before him. Outside his window, the Bosphorus reflected the first pale light of morning, indifferent to the violence that had just shattered a little girl's world 3 floors below. The eunuch guards stationed at his door said nothing. They had learned long ago that some horrors were best left unacknowledged. But Ahmed knew. In that moment, listening to his daughter's terror echo through the palace, he had ruled for 13 years. Sultan Ahmed I understood with terrible clarity that he had sacrificed his own child on the altar of empire. And the worst part, the part that would poison his dreams until death claimed him 20 months later, was that he had done it deliberately, knowingly, with full awareness of what that scream would cost. This is not a story about heroes. It is a story about power and the men who wield it and the price that others pay for their decisions. It is a story that was buried for 400 years in encrypted archives, in coded diaries hidden, because those who knew the truth understood that some revelations could topple dynasties. But in 2019, when historians finally decoded the Persian manuscripts locked in Istanbul's Başbakanlık archives, the world learned what Sultan Ahmed had known since that dawn in 1616. That empires are not built on glory. They are built on the bones of the innocent, and sometimes those bones belong to your own children. 6 months earlier, in the autumn of 1615, the Ottoman Empire stood at a crossroads. For 12 years, Sultan Ahmed had waged war against the Safavid Persians, bleeding his treasury and his armies in campaigns across Mesopotamia and the Caucasus. The fighting had been brutal. At the Battle of Dimdim in 1610, Ottoman forces had massacred an entire Kurdish fortress population after a 9-month siege. At Ganja in 1614, the Safavids had returned the favor, putting 15,000 Ottoman soldiers to the sword. By 1615, both empires were exhausted. Their economies strained, their populations restless. Ahmed had taken the throne at 13, a boy thrust into absolute power after his father's death. Now at 25, he was no longer a boy. 13 years of rule had carved lines into his face that made him look a decade older. He had executed his own brother to secure his succession. He had personally led armies into Hungary. He had built the magnificent Blue Mosque that still dominates Istanbul's skyline, a monument to his piety and his power. But all of that meant nothing if he could not hold his empire together. The problem was structural. The Ottoman military elite, the pashas, who commanded the armies and governed the provinces, had grown restless during the long Persian War. They had expected conquest and plunder. Instead, they had gotten stalemate and empty coffers. Ahmed needed to secure their loyalty, and he needed to do it quickly before the whispers of rebellion in Anatolia turned into open revolt, which is how on a cold October morning in 1615, the proposal came. Kara Mustafa Pasha was 37 years old, a career soldier who had risen through the Janissary ranks by being more ruthless and more brilliant than everyone around him. He had a scar that ran from his left eye to his jaw, a gift from a Persian scimitar at the Battle of Isfahan. He wore it like a badge of honor. Men feared him. Generals respected him. And in October of 1615, he walked into the Imperial Council chamber and made Sultan Ahmed an offer that would destroy them both. The offer was simple. Kara Mustafa would take 15,000 troops into Anatolia and crush the Salali rebellions that had been festering in the countryside for years. He would secure the empire's heartland. He would demonstrate Ottoman strength at a moment when strength was desperately needed. In exchange, he wanted 2 things. First appointment as the next Grand Vizier, when the current occupant, the aging Nasu Pasha, finally died or retired. Second, marriage to an imperial princess. Not just any princess. He wanted Fatma Sultan, Ahmed's eldest daughter, his favorite child, the little girl who used to climb into his lap during war councils and ask why the stars moved across the sky. Ahmed sat on his throne surrounded by his advisors and felt the trap closing around him. He could say no. He was the Sultan. His word was law. But if he said no, Kara Mustafa might refuse the Anatolian campaign. The rebellions would continue. The military elite would see weakness. And weakness in an empire held together by the perception of absolute power could be fatal. His wife Kosum, watching from behind the screen gallery where the imperial women observed council meetings, knew what was coming. She had been born a Greek Christian, captured by Ottoman raiders as a teenager, and sold into the palace harem. Through intelligence and ruthlessness, she had become Haseki Sultan, the emperor's favored consort. She had borne Ahmed multiple children. She understood power better than most of the men in that council chamber. And she knew, watching her husband's face, that he was going to sacrifice their daughter. She also knew that if she tried to stop him, she would fail. The vote was 7-2 in favor of the marriage. Ahmed abstained. It was cowardice dressed up as wisdom, the act of a man who wanted to believe that if he didn't personally vote for his daughter's destruction, he was somehow not responsible for it. As if abstention was different from consent. As if silence was not complicity. When the council ended, Ahmed walked slowly back to his private chambers. Servants bowed as he passed. Guards saluted. Musicians in the gardens played soft melodies. Everything was exactly as it had always been. Except that Ahmed had just signed his daughter's death warrant, and everyone in the palace knew it except Fatma herself. She was 9 years old. Fatma Sultan had been born in the winter of 1606 when her father was 16 and still learning how to be emperor. She had been a beautiful baby with dark eyes that seemed to absorb everything around her, and she had grown into a child of unusual intelligence. By age 6, she could read Arabic and Persian. By 7, she was studying astronomy with the court scholars. By 9, she could recite entire chapters of poetry from memory and calculate the movements of celestial bodies with a precision that impressed men 3 times her age. Ahmed had educated her himself, something almost unheard of for an Ottoman princess. While her sisters learned embroidery and music, Fatma learned history and mathematics. Ahmed would take her to the observatory tower on clear nights, pointing out constellations and explaining the geometry of the heavens. She would ask him questions that he could not answer, and he would laugh and promise to find the answers in his library. He had imagined in those moments that he was preparing her for something more than the usual fate of an imperial daughter. He had thought foolishly that intelligence and education might somehow protect her, that if she was brilliant enough, the empire might find some use for her beyond being a bargaining chip in political marriages. He had been wrong. When Ahmed told her about the marriage, Fatma did not cry. She was sitting in her mother's apartments, surrounded by silk cushions and gilded screens, playing with an astrolabe that her father had given her for her last birthday. He knelt down beside her, something sultans did not do, and took her small hands in his. "You are going to be married," he said. She looked at him with those dark, intelligent eyes. "When?" she asked. "Next spring, March." "To who?" "Kara Mustafa Pasha. He is a great general, a hero of the empire." She was quiet for a long moment, turning the astrolabe over in her hands. "Father," she said finally, "do I have to go?" And Ahmed, who commanded armies and administered justice and held the power of life and death over 20 million souls, found that he could not answer his 9-year-old daughter's simple question. Because the truth was no, she did not have to go. He could stop this. He could refuse the marriage. He could find another way to secure Kara Mustafa's loyalty, but doing so would require him to put his daughter's welfare above the empire's needs, and that was a choice that sultans were not permitted to make. So instead, he lied. "It will be an adventure," he told her. "You will have your own palace, your own household. You will be one of the most important women in the empire." Fatma looked at him for a long moment, and in that look, Ahmed saw that she knew he was lying. She was 9, but she was not stupid. She had lived in the imperial harem her entire life. She had heard the whispered stories of other princesses who had been married off to secure alliances. She knew that adventure was a word men used when they meant sacrifice. But she was also 9, and she loved her father, and she wanted to believe that he would not hurt her. "Will you visit me?" she asked. "Of course," Ahmed said, adding another lie to the growing pile. "Whenever I can." She nodded slowly, then returned her attention to the astrolabe. The conversation was over. Ahmed stood, his knees creaking like an old man's, though he was only 25, and walked out of the room. Behind him, Fatma continued to turn the astrolabe in her hands, watching the brass rings rotate around the central axis, calculating trajectories she would never be free to follow. Kosum found him an hour later in the library, staring at maps he was not really seeing. "You could stop this?" she said quietly. "I cannot," he replied. "You are the Sultan." "I am the Sultan," he agreed, "which means I serve the empire first, always. She is your daughter." "I know. She is 9 years old." "I know that too." Kosum was silent for a moment, then asked the question that neither of them wanted to answer. "Do you know what they will do to her, the training?" Ahmed closed his eyes. "I know. And you are allowing it anyway." It was not a question. It was an accusation. "If I make an exception for my daughter," Ahmed said slowly, "I admit that the system is wrong. If the system is wrong, then what about the 50 princesses before her? What about their suffering? Was that meaningless? Was that avoidable?" "Yes," Kusum said simply. "Then I am a monster," Ahmed said. "And my father was a monster, and his father before him, and every sultan who has ever sat on this throne." "Yes," Kusum repeated. Ahmed opened his eyes and looked at his wife. She was beautiful even now, even with tears running down her face. He wanted to tell her that he was sorry. He wanted to tell her that he would stop this madness. But he had spent 13 years learning that empires were not built on sentiment, and he could not unlearn that lesson now. "Take care of her," he said instead, "in the time she has left." Kosum turned and left without another word. Behind her, Ahmed sat alone among his maps and manuscripts, master of everything and protector of nothing. The system that was about to consume Fatma had been perfected over nearly 2 centuries. It was called Terbiye al-Mubarak, the sacred education, and it had been designed by the court of Mehmed II, the conqueror of Constantinople in the 1450s. Its purpose was simple and brutal. Ottoman princesses born into the highest rank in the empire represented a potential threat. If they were allowed to maintain their pride, their independence, their sense of self, they might form rival power bases. They might influence their husbands to challenge the sultan. They might produce sons who could claim the throne. So the system was designed to break them first. It was not random cruelty. It was engineered cruelty, calibrated over generations to produce a very specific result: absolute obedience, complete psychological submission, the transformation of intelligent, spirited girls into docile, silent women who understood that their only value lay in producing heirs and staying out of politics. The woman who would oversee Fatma's training was named Gulnar Hatun. She was 60 years old and had served in the imperial harem for 4 decades. She had personally supervised the preparation of 17 princesses for marriage. She was not a sadist. She did not enjoy what she did, but she believed in the system with the fervor of a true believer, because the alternative was to admit that she had spent her entire adult life torturing children for no purpose. On the 1st of December, 1615, Gulnar Hatun came to collect Fatma from her mother's apartments. The training would last 12 weeks, 3 months of careful, systematic, psychological destruction. Kosum held her daughter for a long time before letting her go. Fatma did not cry. She had decided somewhere in the week since learning of her fate that she would not give them the satisfaction of seeing her break. She was 9 years old, and she believed with the stubborn optimism of childhood that if she was good enough, obedient enough, smart enough, maybe they would let her come home. She was wrong about that too. The Gelinlik Odası, the bridal chamber, was located in the deepest part of the harem, far from the gardens and courtyards where the younger children played. It was a suite of rooms paneled in dark wood and hung with heavy tapestries that muffled sound. The windows were high and narrow, letting in light, but not views. It was designed to be isolated, disconnected from the normal flow of palace life, a world unto itself. Fatma was brought to the first room and told to stand in the center. Around her, 12 matrons arranged themselves in a semicircle. Gulnar Hatun stood directly in front of her. "You are here," Gulnar said in a voice that was neither kind nor cruel, simply matter of fact, "to learn how to be a wife. Your life until now has been that of a princess. That life is over. When you leave this room in 3 months, you will be a wife. You will belong to your husband. Your thoughts will be his thoughts. Your desires will be his desires. Your body will be on his property." "Do you understand?" Fatma, who had been taught to always answer questions directly, nodded. "Say it," Gulnar commanded. "I understand," Fatma whispered. Louder. "I understand." "Good. We will begin with posture." For the next 6 hours, Fatma learned how to bow. Not the simple bow of respect that she had been taught as a child, but 18 different forms of submission, each designed for a specific situation. There was the greeting bow, a 45-degree angle with eyes cast down and hands crossed over her chest. There was the serving bow, a deeper angle held for 30 seconds, while imagining herself as nothing more than a vessel for her husband's will. There was the bedchamber bow, 90 degrees with hands touching the floor, held until given permission to rise. By the end of the first day, every muscle in Fatma's back and legs was screaming. Her head ached from being held at unnatural angles for hours at a time. But she did not complain. She had decided to be good. The second day began with walking. Fatma was taught to move through a room with her head tilted exactly 30 degrees downward, her steps no longer than 40 centimeters, her hands never rising above heart level. She was taught to sit with her knees pressed together so tightly that a piece of paper could not be slipped between them. She was taught to sleep on her right side facing the direction of Maka, with her hands folded at her chest like a corpse. Every movement was analyzed. Every gesture was corrected. The matrons circled her like hawks, pointing out deviations, demanding perfection. And through it all, Fatma tried to be good. She tried to learn. She tried to please them. On the third day, they began to limit her vocabulary. Fatma, who spoke 4 languages and could recite poetry for hours, was informed that wives were permitted only 43 words. 43 specific words divided into 4 categories. 12 words of gratitude, 8 words of acceptance, 10 words of request, 13 words of apology. I was forbidden. Want was forbidden. No was forbidden. Why was forbidden. Instead, she learned to say, as you wish, and forgive this servant, and I exist to obey. The first time Fatma forgot and used a forbidden word, Gulnar Hatun Bosh had her mouth washed with bitter aloe water. The taste was so vile that Fatma vomited. She was not given water to rinse her mouth. She was told that the taste would help her remember. The second time, the punishment was worse. Fatma was given a solution of cayenne pepper to drink. It burned her throat so badly that she could not speak for 2 days. The matrons marked this in their records as a success. Silence, after all, was better than forbidden words. By the end of the first week, Fatma had stopped trying to speak unless directly questioned. It was safer that way, less painful. But the worst part, the part that she would remember in nightmares for the rest of her short life, came in the second week when they introduced the compliance journal. The compliance journal was a leather-bound book in which the matrons recorded every aspect of Fatma's behavior. Every word, every gesture, every facial expression. The entries were color-coded, green for perfect obedience, yellow for hesitation, red for defiance. Fatma's journal in the first week was mostly red. She had questioned too much, hesitated too often, failed to lower her eyes quickly enough. Let her face show emotion when she should have maintained perfect blankness. Each evening, Gulnar would read the day's entries aloud to Fatma, then explain what punishments these failures had earned. Sometimes it was fasting, sometimes it was hours of kneeling on rough stone. Sometimes it was forced to stand in stress positions until her legs gave out. But the psychological punishment was worse than the physical, because Fatma began to internalize the journal's judgments. She began to see herself as the matron saw her, defiant, disobedient, flawed, a problem to be corrected. By the third week, the journal was showing more yellow than red. By the fourth week, there were even a few green entries. The system was working. The third week of training introduced what Gulnar Hatun called spiritual education. Fatma was given 3 heavy books written in Arabic and Persian and told to memorize passages from each. The books had titles like Advice for Kings and The Ethics of the Virtuous, but their content was identical. Page after page of instructions on wifely obedience, submission, and self-sacrifice. Fatma, who had loved reading, who had spent hours in her father's library exploring philosophy and poetry and science, now spent 10 hours each day reciting verses that made her want to scream. A woman's paradise lies in her husband's satisfaction. Obedience is the highest form of love. The virtuous wife seeks no will beyond her husband's command. She had to recite these passages aloud in front of all 12 matrons until she could do so without a single hesitation or error. If she stumbled over a word, she had to start the entire passage again. Feed them. Prepare them for their nights with the Sultan. This was deliberate psychological torture. These women were not royalty. Many had been slaves before entering the harem. And yet Fatma, a sultan's daughter, was forced to kneel before them and wash their feet. The first time she was ordered to do this, Fatma refused. It was the first and last time she would refuse anything during her training. Gulnar Hatun did not raise her voice. She simply nodded to two matrons, who seized Fatma's arms and held her in place. Then Gulnar herself demonstrated the proper foot washing technique, slowly and carefully explaining each step as if teaching a child how to tie her shoes. "You will do this," Gulnar said calmly, "or you will be held in the reflection chamber for 3 days without food or water. You will do this, or every comfort you have known will be taken away. You will do this because you are learning that even a sultan's daughter can be humbled. Even a princess can serve. Even you, with all your learning and pride, are nothing special." Fatma did it. She knelt, she washed feet, she combed hair, and every time she did, a little more of her pride died. One of the concubines, a woman named Mahfouz, who had never liked Kosum, and by extension disliked Fatma, seemed to take particular pleasure in the reversal. She would deliberately mess her hair after Fatma had spent an hour arranging it, then order her to start over. She would criticize every action, every gesture, making sure that Fatma understood that she was the servant and Mahfouz was the mistress. "Your mother may be Haseki Sultan," Mahfouz said once, watching Fatma arrange her jewelry, "but you are just another girl being prepared for a man's use. Remember that." Fatma said nothing. She had learned that lesson well. Silence was safety. But that night, alone in her chamber, she broke down. For the first time since entering training, she allowed herself to cry. Great racking sobbed that she muffled in her pillow so the matrons would not hear. She cried for the library she would never see again, for the stars she would never study, for the father who had sent her here, for the person she had been and was ceasing to be. When the crying finally stopped, she felt empty, hollow. And in that hollowness, she understood something terrible. The system was working. She was being erased. And part of her was beginning to believe that she deserved it. The 5th week brought a new element to the training. A young cleaning girl named Zeynep, 16 years old, and sympathetic to Fatma's suffering, began sneaking small kindnesses. An extra portion of food, a smile when no one was looking. Once daringly, she brought Fatma a small piece of paper and a charcoal pencil. Fatma had not held writing materials in over a month. Her fingers trembled as she took them. That night, hidden beneath her sleeping mat, she wrote 3 lines in Persian. "I am Fatma Sultan. I am 9 years old. I still exist." It was an act of resistance, so small as to be almost meaningless. But it was resistance nonetheless. Proof that somewhere beneath the layers of training and conditioning, some small part of her original self still survived. She hid the paper inside the spine of one of the religious texts she was required to study. For 3 days, it was her secret treasure. Proof that she was more than what they were making her. Then the matrons found it during a random inspection. Gulnar Hatun read the 3 lines aloud to the assembled matrons, and then slowly and deliberately burned the paper while Fatma watched. "You are not Fatma Sultan anymore," Gulnar said, her voice still maddeningly calm. "That girl is gone. You are a bride, a vessel, a servant. The sooner you accept this, the less you will suffer." Zeynep was dragged in, forced to kneel beside Fatma. She was beaten with a cane across her back, 10 strikes, while Fatma was made to watch. Then she was dismissed from palace service and sent away. Fatma never saw her again. The message was clear. Friendship was forbidden. Kindness was weakness. Resistance, no matter how small, would be crushed. After Zeynep was taken away, Fatma was placed in the reflection chamber. It was a room no larger than 2 meters by 2 meters, completely dark, with no furniture except a prayer mat. She was given water but no food. She would remain there for 48 hours. In the darkness, Fatma began to hallucinate from hunger and isolation. She saw stars on the ceiling that were not there. She heard her father's voice calling her name. She felt her mother's arms around her. None of it was real. When they finally released her, she was so weak that she could barely stand. The matrons had to carry her to the bathing chamber and wash her like an infant. She did not resist. She did not speak. She simply existed, passive and hollow. Her compliance journal that week showed green for every single entry. Perfect obedience. Complete submission. Gulnar Hatun noted this in her report to the Grand Vizier with satisfaction. The Sultan's daughter had been successfully broken. the training could move to its final phase. The final phase began in the 6th week and would last until the wedding. It was called Talim Lail, the night practice, and it took place in chambers beneath the harem that Fatma had never known existed. She was brought down a narrow staircase lit by oil lamps that cast flickering shadows on stone walls. The air smelled of incense and something else, something medicinal and slightly sweet. At the bottom of the stairs was a heavy wooden door with brass fittings. Gulnar opened it and led Fatma inside. The room was a perfect replica of a bridal chamber. Silk hangings, Persian carpets, a large bed with carved posts. But something about it felt wrong. The drugs helped. Every morning now, Fatma was given what the matrons called calming tea. It was made with poppy extract, valerian root, and mandrake substances that made her feel disconnected from her own body. She would float through the sessions as if watching them happen to someone else. The wax figure, the instructions, the corrections. All of it felt distant, unreal, like a nightmare she could not wake from. She began to develop a technique for surviving. She would leave her body mentally imagining herself back in the observatory with her father counting stars. While the matrons gave their instructions and the physicians recorded their observations, Fatma would be somewhere else entirely, somewhere safe and distant and untouchable. The physicians had a name for this. They called it soul departure. They noted it in their records as a positive sign. It meant that the training was working. The girl was learning to separate herself from her physical experiences, which would make the actual wedding night easier to endure. By the 8th week, Fatma no longer recognized herself in the mirrors that lined the practice chamber. The girl looking back at her had vacant eyes and a blank expression. She moved when told to move, spoke when told to speak, performed when told to perform, but there was no one home behind those eyes anymore. Meanwhile, in the world beyond the Gaelinlik Odası, Kara Mustafa Pasha was having his own crisis of conscience. The general had spent the months of November and December 1615 crushing the Salali rebellions in Anatolia with his characteristic efficiency. 15,000 troops under his command had swept through the countryside, putting down resistance and executing ringleaders. By January 1616, the rebellion was over. Kara Mustafa returned to Constantinople, a hero praised in the mosques and celebrated in the streets. But something was bothering him. An intercepted message from the palace had reached him in late December. It had been meant for the cleaning girl Zeynep from her brother, who served in Kara Mustafa's own Janissary unit. The message contained a warning from Princess Fatma about something called the training. The details were vague, written in code that the military censors could not fully decipher. But the tone was clear. Fear, desperation, a plea for help. Kara Mustafa had ordered the message destroyed and thought nothing more of it, but it had planted a seed of doubt. In January, returned to the capital, he began asking questions. Quietly at first over drinks with older generals, then more directly. What happened to the princesses before their weddings? What was this training he had heard whispers about? Most of the men he asked changed the subject or gave vague, uncomfortable answers. But one man, a 70-year-old general named Halil Pasha, who had married an imperial princess 40 years earlier, told him the truth. They break them, Halil said, his voice rough with age and regret. Systematically, deliberately, they take girls who are proud and intelligent and they destroy everything that makes them human. And then they give us the shells and tell us to make wives of them. Kara Mustafa stared at the old man. You allowed this. I did not know until it was too late, Halil said. And by then, what could I do? The empire had given me a wife. The empire expected me to accept her and produce heirs, so I did. And I watched her die a little more each day for 20 years until she finally had the mercy to actually die and end her suffering. Why did no one stop it? Halil laughed a bitter sound. Stop it. It is the system. It has been the system for 200 years. You think you are the first man to question it? You think you are the first husband to realize what was done to his bride? But what are you going to do, Mustafa? Refuse the marriage, speak out against the Sultan. You are a soldier. You follow orders. And this is the order you have been given. Kara Mustafa left that conversation deeply shaken. He was a warrior. He had killed men in battle. He had ordered executions. He had put cities to the sword. But those had been acts of war against enemies who could fight back. This was different. This was violence against a child who had no defense, no escape, no hope of rescue. He told himself that he would be different, that when the wedding came, he would treat Fatma with gentleness and respect, that he could somehow undo the damage that had been done to her, that his kindness could heal what the matrons had broken. He was wrong about that too. In February, Fatma entered the final month of training. She was moved to a small pavilion called the Galen Koshku, the bride's house, and placed in complete isolation. No one was allowed to visit her except the matrons and physicians. No sounds from the outside world reached her. She existed in a bubble of silence, broken only by the instructions of her trainers and the scratching of pens in the compliance journal. Her days followed an unvarying routine. 4 hours of prayer reciting the special supplications that had been written for her. 3 hours of physical preparation, baths and scented oils applications of henna and cosmetics. 2 hours of review practicing her bows and her limited vocabulary. 1 hour of eating always under supervision, a special diet designed to make her skin glow and her body ready for marriage. And every day, the mirrors. The bride's house was lined with Venetian mirrors, dozens of them positioned, so that everywhere Fatma looked, she saw herself. This was called muraqaba, originally a Sufi meditation practice, now twisted into a tool of control. She was forced to watch herself practice submission, to see herself being transformed into a bride, to witness her own erasure. By the end of February, Fatma could no longer remember what it felt like to be the girl who had loved astronomy. That girl was gone, replaced by this strange, hollow creature who existed only to please others. The final week before the wedding brought the most intensive preparations yet. Fatma was bathed 3 times a day in water mixed with sedative oils. Her diet was adjusted again, pomegranates and honey and almonds, foods that the physicians said would make her more fertile and compliant. She was dressed and undressed countless times, the matrons adjusting every fold of fabric, every piece of jewelry, making sure that on the wedding day itself, nothing would be left to chance. And every evening, Gulnar Hatun would sit with her and explain in that same calm clinical voice exactly what would be expected of her on the wedding night. The explanations were detailed, explicit, designed to prepare Fatma for what was coming, while also ensuring that she understood her role as passive recipient, never active participant. Fatma listened with the same blank expression she wore for everything now. She did not ask questions. She did not show fear. She simply absorbed the information like a sponge absorbs water mechanically and without resistance. On the final day before the wedding, Gulnar administered the final test. Fatma had to perform all 18 forms of submission perfectly while reciting the permitted words while maintaining perfect composure and blank expression. She had to prove that the training had taken, that the transformation was complete. She passed. Gulnar Hatun made a final notation in the compliance journal. Green, perfect obedience. The Sultan's daughter was ready to become Kara Mustafa Pasha's wife. That night alone, for the last time in the bride's house, Fatma stood at the window and looked up at the stars. She could name them all once: Sirius, Betelgeuse, Rigel. Her father had taught her their names and their stories, but now looking at them, she felt nothing. They were just points of light in a dark sky, beautiful and distant and utterly irrelevant to her existence. She wondered briefly if her father was looking at the same stars, if he was thinking of her, if he regretted his choice. Then she pushed the thought away. It did not matter what her father thought. It did not matter what she thought. Tomorrow she would be married. Tomorrow her real life would end and her existence as a possession would begin. And there was nothing, absolutely nothing, that anyone could do to stop it. March 15, 1616 dawned clear and cold over Constantinople. The city had been preparing for this wedding for weeks. It was not just a marriage. It was a demonstration of Ottoman power and wealth, a spectacle designed to remind everyone from the lowest peasant to the foreign ambassadors that the empire was strong and its sultan was in control. 3,000 guests filled the palace grounds. Musicians from Persia and Andalusia played complex melodies on ouds and nays. Dancers whirled in silk costumes that caught the morning light. Tables groaned under the weight of food, whole roasted lambs, and mountains of rice and delicacies imported from every corner of the empire. The scent of incense and roses filled the air. In the Blue Mosque, Sultan Ahmed's magnificent creation that had been completed just 3 years earlier, imams led prayers for the bride and groom. Janissaries put on martial displays demonstrating their skill with swords and spears. Poets recited verses praising Kara Mustafa's military prowess and Fatma's beauty. It was a celebration that would be talked about for years, but in a small chamber, deep in the harem, the bride herself sat motionless while servants painted her face white with lead powder and antimony, a traditional makeup that made her look like a porcelain doll. She did not speak. She barely seemed to breathe. Her eyes stared at nothing while the servants worked transforming her into an object of beauty that bore no resemblance to the little girl who had once calculated the orbit of Saturn. In another chamber, Sultan Ahmed prepared himself for the ceremony. He wore robes of state, heavy with gold embroidery and seed pearls. His turban was wrapped with a jeweled agate that had belonged to Suleiman the Magnificent. He looked every inch the emperor master of 3 continents and commander of the faithful, but his hands shook as he fastened his belt. Kusum came to him an hour before the ceremony. She wore black, which was unusual for a wedding. When Ahmed asked about it, she simply said, "I am in mourning." "For what?" "For our daughter, the one who died 3 months ago, even though her heart still beats." Ahmed said nothing. What could he say? She was right. "You could still stop this," Kusum said quietly. "Even now, you could call it off. You could send Kara Mustafa to another campaign. You could find another way." "There is no other way," Ahmed said, and perhaps he even believed it. "The alliance is sealed. The council has approved. The guests are here. To cancel now would show weakness. So you choose the appearance of strength over your daughter's life." "I choose the empire," Ahmed said, "as I must, as every sultan before me has chosen." "Then I hope," Kusum said softly, "that the empire is worth the price you have paid for it." She left without another word. The ceremony itself was a blur of ritual and spectacle. Fatma was led through the palace gardens on a litter surrounded by singing women and flower petals. She wore a wedding dress that weighed nearly 20 pounds, white silk embroidered with gold thread and hung with pearls from the Persian Gulf. On her head was a crown so heavy that her neck ached within minutes. On her wrists and ankles were bracelets that looked like jewelry but functioned like shackles, subtly restricting her movement. She could barely walk in the thick-soled shoes they had given her. Each step was a carefully balanced shuffle. She could not have run even if she had wanted to. The dress itself was designed to constrain with hidden cords and internal structure that made it impossible to move freely. She was a living doll, beautiful and helpless and utterly trapped. Kara Mustafa stood at the end of the garden path, surrounded by his officers and attendants. He wore military dress, his chest covered in medals from campaigns across the empire. The scar on his face looked particularly vivid in the afternoon sun. He watched his bride approach and felt something cold settle in his stomach. She looked like a child, because she was a child, 10 years old, drowning in silk and gold, her face painted so heavily that he could not see her real features. Her eyes were the only thing visible, dark and huge and completely empty. In that moment, seeing what was being delivered to him like a package, Kara Mustafa understood that he had made a terrible mistake. But it was too late to back out now. The ceremony was underway. The imam was reciting the prayers. The guests were watching. All he could do was play his part and hope that somehow, some way he could make this right later. The religious ceremony was mercifully brief. Vows were exchanged, though Fatma's responses were barely audible whispers. Gifts were presented, prayers were offered, and then it was done. Fatma Sultan, age 10, was legally married to Kara Mustafa Pasha, age 37. The celebration continued for hours. Musicians played, dancers performed, guests ate and drank and congratulated the groom on his good fortune. Sultan Ahmed sat on his throne and accepted praise for the magnificent wedding he had provided. He smiled and nodded and played his role perfectly. But inside, he felt like he was dying. He watched his daughter being led away toward the bridal pavilion as the sun set. She moved like a ghost, silent and unresisting. He wanted to run after her. He wanted to grab her and hold her and tell her he was sorry. He wanted to undo the last 3 months, the last year, the last decade of decisions that had led to this moment. Instead, he sat on his throne and did nothing. The bridal pavilion was a 3-story octagonal structure in the palace gardens. It had been built specifically for royal weddings, designed with the same careful attention to psychological control as everything else in the system. The first floor was devoted to purification. Fatma was brought here as soon as the public celebration ended, while Kara Mustafa remained at the banquet for another hour as tradition demanded. 6 matrons supervised her final bath, which lasted 3 hours. The water was perfumed with damask rose and jasmine and sandalwood. Oils were applied to every inch of her skin, oils that contained the same sedative substances she had been consuming for weeks. The effect the physicians who had designed this protocol noted in their records was a state they called euphoric submission. The body became relaxed, pliant, disconnected from conscious control. The mind remained aware but at a distance, observing rather than experiencing. It was the final layer of protection, ensuring that when the wedding night came, the bride would not resist. Fatma floated through the bath in a haze. She was aware of hands touching her, washing her, anointing her, but it all felt like it was happening to someone else. She could hear the matrons talking, their voices low and clinical, but the words did not seem to mean anything. The second floor was devoted to final preparation. Here Fatma was dressed in a nightgown of such thin silk that it was almost transparent. The bridal crown was removed, replaced with a simple circlet. Her hair was brushed until it shone, then left loose down her back. More oils were applied, more prayers were recited. Gulnar Hatun stood before her and delivered final instructions. The same instructions she had been given dozens of times before. How to stand, how to greet her husband, which of the 43 permitted words to use, how to position her body, how to endure. Fatma listened with that same blank expression. She understood the words. She would obey the instructions. She had no choice. Remember, Gulnar said quietly, that this is your duty. This is what you were born for. Your only value is in pleasing your husband and producing his heirs. Everything else about you, all of your learning and your pride and your dreams, none of that matters. You are a vessel, a servant, property. The sooner you accept this, the easier your life will be. Fatma nodded. She had accepted it weeks ago. She had no strength left to fight. Then she was led to the stairs that climbed to the 3rd floor. The Zifaf Katu, the consummation chamber. The room was exactly like the practice chamber in the underground training area. The same silk hangings, the same Persian carpets, the same large bed with carved posts. But this time it was real. This time there would be no wax figure. This time there would be a man. The matrons positioned Fatma in the center of the room and then withdrew. The door closed behind them. She was alone. For perhaps 5 minutes she stood there swaying slightly, barely able to remain upright after 3 hours of drugged bathing. Her mind was very far away, observing all of this from a great distance. She noticed that the tapestries on the walls depicted military conquests, cities burning, armies defeated, prisoners being led away in chains. It was deliberate symbolism. Conquest in war and conquest in marriage, forever linked in Ottoman ideology. Then the second door opened and Kara Mustafa entered. He had been prepared for this moment by the same veteran generals who had advised him to seek this marriage in the first place. They had given him instructions on how to establish dominance immediately, how to show strength, how to make clear that he was master and she was subject. They had told him stories of other princesses who had tried to use their royal status to dominate their husbands, and how those marriages had ended in disaster. But they had not prepared him for this. The girl standing in the center of the room was not a proud princess who needed to be put in her place. She was a child barely able to stand, with eyes that looked through him rather than at him. She was so small that the thin nightgown hung on her like a tent. She did not look defiant or challenging, or anything that would require his martial skills to overcome. She looked broken. Kara Mustafa, who had faced Persian cavalry charges without flinching, who had led assaults on fortified cities, who had executed rebels without hesitation, found himself completely unprepared for this moment. All of his training, all of his preparation, all of his confidence evaporated. He tried to speak gently. Fatma Sultan, you do not need to be afraid. She did not respond. She simply stood there, swaying. He moved closer. I will not hurt you. I know this is frightening, but I promise I will be gentle. Still no response. Her eyes were fixed on something he could not see, somewhere far away from this room in this moment. He reached out to touch her shoulder, and she flinched violently, her whole body jerking backward. But she did not cry out. She did not speak. She simply stood there, trembling, waiting for him to do whatever he was going to do. And in that flinch, Kara Mustafa finally understood. This was not a marriage. This was not a union of two people. This was a ritual sacrifice, and he was the knife. But the empire expected consummation. The physicians were waiting outside to verify it. His promotion to Grand Vizier depended on completing this marriage properly. And he had spent his entire life following orders, doing his duty, serving the empire. So he did what the empire required of him. What happened in that room over the next several hours was recorded in encrypted Persian documents that would not be decoded for 400 years. The physicians who examined Fatma afterward used clinical language to describe internal injuries, repeated episodes of fainting, and what they called ruhun ayrılması, the departure of the soul. Kara Mustafa himself never spoke of it to anyone, but in letters discovered after his death, he wrote, "I destroyed a child to gain power, and the power has turned to ashes in my mouth." At dawn, the scream that opened this story tore through the palace. It was not a scream of physical pain, though there was that too. It was the sound of a mind breaking of a child suddenly coming back to awareness and realizing what had been done to her. Sultan Ahmed, 3 floors away in his war room, heard it and felt something inside him shatter. The official announcement went out at midday. The marriage had been successfully consummated. Princess Fatma Sultan was now the honored wife of Kara Mustafa Pasha. May Allah bless their union with many sons. But in the private communications between the palace physicians and the Grand Vizier, a different message was transmitted. The princess had suffered what they termed absolute shock. Her psychological state was severely compromised. Recovery was possible but not certain. Recommend immediate intervention. The interventions consisted of more drugs, more sedatives, more attempts to force the broken girl to eat and sleep and behave normally. None of it worked. Fatma Sultan lived for 29 more years after her wedding night, but in any meaningful sense, she died in that chamber on March 16, 1616. What remained was a ghost that wore her name and her face but contained none of her spirit. In the days and weeks immediately following the wedding, her condition deteriorated rapidly. She developed what the physicians called selective mutism, speaking only in whispers and only when directly commanded. She refused food until she was forcibly fed. She had panic attacks whenever any man, even trusted eunuchs, came near her. She would cry for hours without apparent cause and then fall into periods of frightening blankness where she seemed barely aware of her surroundings. The court physicians tried everything they knew: herbal remedies, Sufi spiritual exercises, music therapy, prayer. Nothing restored her. The brilliant, curious child who had loved astronomy and poetry and learning was simply gone, replaced by this hollow shell that existed but did not live. Kosem Sultan visited her daughter every day for the first month, sitting beside her bed and talking to her even though Fatma rarely responded. She would tell her stories from when Fatma was small. She would describe the gardens and the palace gossip. She would beg her daughter to speak, to eat, to show some sign of the person she had been. But Fatma would only stare at the ceiling, silent and distant. After a month, even Kosem's visits became less frequent. It was too painful to sit with the ruin of her daughter and know that she had been powerless to prevent it. Sultan Ahmed never visited Fatma after the wedding. He could not bear to see what his choices had created. Instead, he received regular reports from the physicians. Each one was worse than the last. The princess was not improving. The princess had attempted self-harm. The princess had stopped speaking entirely. The princess existed in a state of permanent dissociation from which she might never return. Ahmed threw himself into state business, working 18 hours a day, as if he could outrun his guilt through sheer busyness. He commissioned more buildings. He planned more military campaigns. He micromanaged every detail of imperial administration. And every night alone in his chambers, he imagined he could hear his daughter screaming. Kara Mustafa Pasha did not fare much better. He had gotten what he wanted. In 1621, when Grand Vizier Nasu Pasha finally died, Mustafa was appointed to the position. He was 43 years old and stood at the pinnacle of Ottoman power, second only to the Sultan himself. But he could not sleep. He had moved Fatma to a separate residence immediately after the wedding, unable to bear living in the same palace with her. He visited her occasionally out of duty when protocol required him to produce heirs. Those visits were nightmares. Fatma would lie still and unresisting, her eyes fixed on some distant point, while he performed the minimum necessary to attempt conception. It felt less like intimacy than like desecrating a corpse. She bore him two children, a son in 1625 and a daughter in 1627. Both times the pregnancies were traumatic. Both times she showed no maternal instinct toward the infants. They were taken immediately by wet nurses and raised in separate quarters. Fatma never asked about them. After the second birth, Mustafa stopped visiting her entirely. He told himself it was mercy. In reality, it was cowardice. He could not face what he had done. He sought escape in work and military campaigns, in the exercise of power. But the guilt followed him everywhere. He began using opium first, occasionally, then regularly, then constantly. It was the only thing that let him sleep without nightmares. His letters from this period, discovered in archives centuries later, reveal a man being eaten alive by remorse. "I was given a brilliant star and crushed it to dust with my bare hands," he wrote to a friend in 1628. "I thought I was claiming a prize. Instead, I destroyed the only innocent thing I have ever touched." In 1632, Kara Mustafa Pasha died during a military campaign in Poland. The official report said he was killed in battle. But soldiers who were there whispered that he had ridden directly into enemy fire, making no attempt to defend himself. Whether it was suicide or simply a death wish fulfilled, no one could say for certain. Sultan Ahmed I did not live to see Mustafa's death. The Sultan, who had taken the throne at 13 and ruled through wars and rebellions and political crises, died on November 22, 1617, at the age of 27. The official cause was typhus. But those close to him said he had been dying slowly ever since his daughter's wedding, his health declining in pace with his spirit. On his deathbed, Ahmed called for Fatma. Messengers were sent to her residence. They returned with the news that she refused to come, or perhaps could not come. By that point, she rarely left her chambers at all. Ahmed's last words recorded by the imam at his bedside were, "Forgive me, my daughter." There is no record that she ever did. After Ahmed's death, his brother Mustafa briefly took the throne, then Ahmed's young son Osman II. The empire continued as empires do, indifferent to the individual tragedies that accumulated in its wake. Fatma Sultan lived in her separate residence for 28 more years. She was maintained at royal expense, given servants and beautiful clothes and every material comfort. She attended occasional state functions when protocol absolutely demanded it, always silent, always distant. She produced no more children after 1627. She never learned to smile again. Those who saw her in her later years said she had the eyes of a very old woman even when she was still young. She never regained her love of learning. The astronomy books that had once been her treasures remained locked in a trunk untouched. The astrolabe her father had given her had been thrown into the Bosphorus shortly after the wedding. She never asked for a replacement. She died on March 15, 1645, exactly 29 years after her wedding day. She was 39 years old. The official cause of death was recorded as brain fever. But the coincidence of the date led many to suspect suicide, though no evidence was ever found. She was buried in a simple grave in Eyüp Sultan Cemetery. The inscription read, "Fatma Sultan, daughter of Ahmed, the first wife of Kara Mustafa Pasha." It did not mention her intelligence. It did not mention her love of stars. It did not mention the girl she had been before the empire consumed her. And for nearly 400 years, that was where her story ended. But Fatma Sultan was not unique. She was not even unusual. She was simply one of more than 100 Ottoman princesses who were fed into the same machinery between 1520 and 1700. When the Başbakanlık archives in Istanbul finally opened certain classified sections to researchers in the early 2000s, historians began to piece together the full scope of what had been done. Encrypted documents were decoded, personal diaries written in mixed languages were translated, medical records were analyzed, and slowly the pattern emerged. Between 1520 and 1700, 127 princesses were married according to the Terbiye al-Mubarak protocol. 73% showed documented signs of severe psychological trauma. 34% died before age 40, an unusually high mortality rate for women of royal status who had access to the best medical care of their era. 12 confirmed suicides. Dozens more whose deaths were suspiciously timed or suspiciously vague. And hundreds of years of silence because those who knew the truth understood that some revelations could shake the foundations of empires. But there were also stories of resistance. Gavurhan Sultan, married in 1648, at age 16, spent 38 years in complete madness. But in her lucid moments, she wrote poetry in code that documented the training. Her writings, discovered hidden in the binding of a Quran, provided some of the most detailed accounts of what happened in the Gelinlik Odası. Hanzade Sultan, married in 1630 at age 14, developed psychosomatic blindness. She simply refused to see her mind shutting down that sense rather than continue witnessing her own existence. She lived 20 more years in self-imposed darkness. Aisha Sultan, Fatma's younger sister, was forced into marriage at age 16 in 1627. She lasted 6 months before drinking poison. Her suicide note, one of the few to survive, consisted of 4 words in Persian. "Sister, you were right, but there were also the ones who got away." Safia Sultan, married in 1680, at age 15, managed to fake her own death 3 years later. She bribed a physician to declare her dead of plague, then fled Constantinople disguised as a widow. She made it to Greece, where she lived as a merchant for another 40 years. Her story only came to light when researchers found her will in a Venetian archive written in old age, explaining what she had escaped and why. Mihrima Sultan, married in 1701, became the only princess in the entire era to successfully divorce her husband. She petitioned Sultan Mustafa II, directly documenting the training she had endured and arguing that a marriage contracted under such conditions was invalid under Islamic law. Her petition was denied 3 times before finally being accepted in 1709. She lived independently for another 30 years, never remarrying, dedicating her life to charitable works in the quiet subversion of the system that had tried to destroy her. And there were the underground networks, embroidered messages passed between princesses in different households, poetry written in mixed languages that looked like religious devotion but actually contained warnings and support. Secret codes developed to communicate past the censors and watchers. Sympathetic eunuchs who carried messages between isolated women, risking punishment to maintain these fragile threads of connection. Even in the darkest system, resistance flickered. Small, fragile, often futile, but present. The system itself continued until the Ottoman Empire fell in 1922. The last princess married according to the old protocol was wed in 1918, 4 years before the empire's dissolution. There is no record of what happened to her. The question that haunts anyone who studies this history is simple. Why? Why did it continue for so long? How could an empire that produced magnificent art and architecture and literature, that preserved classical learning through the Dark Ages, that built one of the most sophisticated administrative systems in history, how could that same empire systematically torture its own daughters for 400 years? The answer is both simple and terrible. Because it worked. The system achieved exactly what it was designed to achieve. It prevented royal princesses from becoming independent power bases. It ensured their absolute loyalty to their husbands. It kept them out of politics. It turned potential rivals into docile producers of heirs. And it continued because responsibility was distributed. No single person could be blamed. The Sultan approved but did not implement. The Grand Vizier implemented but did not design. The matrons followed protocols that had been developed over generations. The physicians kept clinical records. The religious scholars provided theological justification. Everyone was just doing their job. This is how systematic evil functions. Not through extraordinary villainy, but through ordinary bureaucracy. Not through monsters, but through people who convince themselves that they are just following orders, maintaining traditions, serving the greater good. Sultan Ahmed I was not a monster. He loved his daughter, but he loved empire more, or thought he did, or thought he had to. And so he fed Fatma to the system and told himself it was necessary. Kara Mustafa Pasha was not a monster. He was a soldier who thought he could overcome the system through personal kindness. He learned too late that individual goodness cannot fix structural evil. And so he destroyed a child and spent the rest of his life trying to forget what he had done. Gulnar Hatun was not a monster. She genuinely believed she was helping princesses, preparing them for lives they could not avoid, making the inevitable easier to bear. The fact that she was wrong, that she was an instrument of torture, did not change her sincere conviction that she was serving a higher purpose. And the system ground on, fed by the very reasonable people who staffed it, until the empire itself collapsed and took the machinery of control down with it. In 1924, the Topkapi Palace became a museum. The Gelinlik Odası, where Fatma and dozens of others had been broken, was open to tourists. For decades, visitors walked through those rooms with no idea what had happened there. The plaques talked about bride preparation and traditional customs. The guides spoke of honor and duty and the marriages that secured alliances. No one mentioned the screams. In 1950, some of the archives began to open. Historians started asking questions. In the 1970s, feminist scholars began specifically researching the lives of Ottoman women, pushing past the sanitized official histories. In the 1990s, the first academic papers appeared, suggesting that the marriage protocols might have been traumatic for the princesses involved. But it was not until 2019 when Dr. Ayşe Börekçi of Istanbul University decoded a cache of Persian documents that had been classified since the 17th century that the full scope became clear. Her paper published in the Journal of Ottoman Studies was titled The Wedding Night Horror Systematic Abuse in Imperial Marriage Preparation 1520 to 1918. It went viral. International media picked it up. For weeks, the story of Fatma Sultan and the others like her dominated headlines around the world. People were horrified, outraged. How could this have happened? How could no one have known? How could it have continued for so long? The answers to those questions are uncomfortable. It happened because power without accountability becomes tyranny. It continued because good people remained silent. It stayed hidden because those who knew had reasons to keep quiet, and those who might have spoken were silenced. And it is not unique to the Ottoman Empire. Similar patterns have been found in Chinese imperial court records, in Russian Tsarist archives, in European royal marriages where young girls were sent to foreign courts and forbidden to speak their native languages or maintain contact with their families. The details vary, the methods differ, but the underlying reality is the same. Throughout history, women and children have been treated as property, as pawns, as tools to be used by those in power. And throughout history, systems have been developed to ensure their compliance. Some of those systems were subtle, operating through social pressure and economic dependence. Others, like the Ottoman Terbiye al-Mubarak, were explicit and brutal. But all of them relied on the same mechanism: silence. The silence of victims who had no voice. The silence of witnesses who looked away. The silence of participants who told themselves they were just following orders. The silence of historians who wrote the official records that erased uncomfortable truths. That silence has been broken now. Fatma's scream, echoing across 400 years, has finally been heard. But the question remains: what will we do with what we have learned? In 2021, the Topkapi Palace Museum opened a new permanent exhibition titled Hidden Lives Ottoman Imperial Women. It includes sections on the Gelinlik Odası, complete with translations of the training, protocols, and testimonies from the princesses themselves. Visitors can see Fatma's compliance journal with its green and red and yellow notations. They can read excerpts from her coded diary, the 3 lines she wrote that got Zeynep beaten. They can see the wedding dress she wore, still preserved, 20 pounds of silk and gold, that was designed to be a beautiful prison. The exhibition is controversial in Turkey. Some see it as airing dirty laundry, as Western propaganda designed to make the Ottoman Empire look barbaric. Others see it as necessary truth-telling, as confronting a past that has been hidden for too long. But everyone who walks through that exhibition leaves changed. Because once you understand what was done to Fatma, to Geverhan, to Ayşe, to all the others, you cannot unknow it. You cannot pretend that empires are built only on glory. You cannot ignore the cost that others paid for the power of the few. Today in Eyüp Sultan Cemetery, Fatma's grave receives visitors, mostly women. They leave flowers and whispered prayers. Some leave notes written on small pieces of paper and tucked into the cracks of the headstone. Your suffering was not forgotten. We hear you now. Rest in peace, little star. The cemetery groundskeeper collects these notes periodically. There are hundreds of them, thousands, from women all over the world who have come to pay respects to a girl who died 400 years ago, but whose story still resonates. Because Fatma's story is not just about the Ottoman Empire. It is about every system that treats human beings as objects. It is about every father who sacrifices his children for ambition. It is about every person who follows orders without questioning whether those orders are just. It is about every society that maintains its structure through the suffering of the powerless. And it is about the responsibility that comes with knowing. Sultan Ahmed I died at 27, poisoned by guilt over a decision he could have made differently. He told himself he had no choice. He told himself empire demanded sacrifice. He told himself that his daughter's suffering is necessary for the greater good. He was wrong. There is always a choice. The choice may be costly. It may require courage. It may mean losing power or status or security, but it exists. Ahmed could have refused to marry Fatma to Kara Mustafa. He could have found another way to secure loyalty. He could have reformed the marriage system. He could have used his absolute power to protect his child instead of sacrificing her. He chose not to. And he spent his last years understanding that his choice had been cowardice dressed up as duty. Kara Mustafa could have refused the marriage. He could have spoken out against the training protocols. He could have sacrificed his career rather than participate in the destruction of a child. He chose not to, and he spent his last years seeking death as an escape from what he had done. Gulnar Hatun could have questioned the system she served. She could have documented what she saw and submitted it to religious scholars for review. She could have refused to participate in child abuse, even if it cost her position. She chose not to, and she died believing she had served honorably, never understanding that she had been an instrument of torture. All of them had choices. All of them chose empire over humanity. All of them paid prices for those choices, though none of those prices came close to matching what Fatma paid. And that is the final lesson of this story. The cost of oppression is always borne most heavily by the oppressed. But the oppressors pay too in guilt and shame and the knowledge of what they have done. Evil diminishes everyone it touches, victims and perpetrators alike. The Ottoman Empire lasted 623 years. At its height, it controlled territory spanning 3 continents. Its architectural achievements still inspire awe. Its administrative systems influence governments across Europe and Asia. Its cultural contributions to art, literature, music, and science were substantial. But it was built on bones, on the backs of slaves and the suffering of conquered peoples, and the systematic destruction of its own daughters. And when the empire finally fell, when the last sultan abdicated and the Turkish Republic rose from the ruins, one of the first things the new government did was abolish the old marriage protocols. Too late for Fatma, too late for the 127 princesses who had gone before, but not too late to ensure that no more children would be fed into that machinery. In the Topkapi Palace Museum, in a glass case in the new exhibition, sits Fatma's astronomy notebook, the one she had hidden her coded diary in. The one that was locked in a trunk for 29 years and then discovered after her death. Visitors can see it but cannot touch it. The pages are fragile with age, the ink faded but still legible. On the first page, in a child's careful handwriting, is a dedication. To my father who taught me to love the stars. May we watch them together always. Below that, in different ink added years later in a shaking hand, is a second line. The stars are still there. We are not. That is all that remains of Fatma Sultan. A grave with a simple marker, a notebook with a broken promise, a scream that echoed through 400 years of silence before finally being heard. But her story and the stories of all the others like her matter. They matter because they remind us that power without accountability becomes tyranny, that systems can be evil even when individuals within them are not monsters. That silence is complicity, that there is always a choice even when that choice is costly. They matter because the mechanisms that destroyed Fatma still exist in different forms in different places, operating through different methods, but serving the same purpose. The silencing of the powerless, the treatment of human beings as property, the sacrifice of individuals for the supposed good of systems. And they matter because remembering is resistance. Every time someone learns Fatma's story, every time someone visits her grave, every time someone refuses to accept that suffering is necessary or inevitable or acceptable, the silence breaks a little more. The Ottoman Empire is gone. The Gelinlik Odası is a museum. The matrons and physicians and architects of that system are long dead. But the choice that Sultan Ahmed faced still exists. The choice between protecting the powerless or serving the powerful. Between individual humanity and systemic demands. Between courage and cowardice. Every generation faces that choice in different forms. Every person in power faces it multiple times. And the answer we give determines what kind of world we build. 400 years ago, a little girl who loved astronomy was systematically destroyed by the empire her father ruled. She screamed once and then spent the rest of her short life in silence. Now finally her scream has been heard. The question is, what will we do with what we have learned? Will we look away comfortable in our distance from events so long past? Will we tell ourselves that things are different now, that such horrors could not happen in our enlightened age? Or will we recognize that the same dynamics still operate? That power still corrupts, that systems still destroy, that silence still enables? Will we commit to breaking our own silences, to questioning our own systems, to choosing humanity over convenience? The choice, as always, is ours. Fatma Sultan cannot answer that question. She has been silent for nearly 400 years. But her story speaks. And if we have the courage to listen, it tells us everything we need to know about the price of power, the cost of silence, and the responsibility that comes with knowing. The stars she loved are still visible over Istanbul on clear nights. They trace the same paths they did when she was 9 years old calculating orbits in her father's observatory. They are beautiful and distant and utterly indifferent to human suffering. But we are not stars. We are people, and people have choices. May we choose more wisely than those who came before.